I am 99 years old. My memory for recent things fails me constantly now. What I ate for breakfast, the name of the nurse who brings my medication in the morning. But December 17th, 1944, I remember with the clarity of a photograph. The cold, the smell of frozen Belgian soil under my boots, the sound of jerry cans being pried open one after another, the metallic scrape of lids, the sharp chemical smell of high-octane gasoline rising into the pre-dawn air, and the feeling, God help me, I am ashamed of it now, but I must be honest, the feeling of absolute joy. We had found it. We had found the fuel. My name is Werner Kessler. In December 1944, I was 20 years old. A Unterscharfer in the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, assigned as a loader in a Panther tank under the command of Kampfer Piper. Joachim Piper was 29 years old and already a legend in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, veteran of the Eastern Front, one of the youngest regimental commanders in the entire SSI, had followed men like him for 3 years with the complete faith that only the young and the indoctrinated can manufacture from nothing and call conviction. In December 1944, that faith was running on fumes, almost literally. The Ardennes offensive had been sold to us as the war's turning point. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the plan that would split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate. We had been told to believe in it. Some of us did. Others, the ones who had been on the Eastern Front long enough to understand what industrial warfare actually meant, believed in it the way exhausted men believe in anything that offers the possibility of an end. Our column was the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire offensive. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 of the Waffen-SS's best soldiers, the tip of the spear. What I did not know on December 14th, when we received our fuel allocation for the operation, was that the spear had already been thrown with insufficient force to reach its target. Our fuel allocation was 31,000 gallons for the entire advance to the Meuse River. The Meuse was 65 miles away. A Panther tank in the Ardennes terrain consumed fuel at a rate that made 65 miles feel like a mathematical impossibility rather than a tactical objective. Piper issued his orders before we moved out, single file, to conserve fuel. Engines off during halts longer than 5 minutes, and the capture of American fuel dumps was priority 1, above tactical objectives, above everything. I remember thinking, standing beside my tank in the darkness on December 15th, that an offensive whose primary tactical goal was stealing the enemy's gasoline was perhaps not the offensive. We had been told it was dot. We crossed the line of departure on December 16th, already behind schedule. The roads that German maps showed as highways were narrow, country lanes, many unpaved, none designed for the weight of Tiger and Panther tanks, moving in column through a forest in winter darkness. At Lanzereth, a single American intelligence platoon, 18 men, stopped the most powerful armored column the Wehrmacht had assembled in the West for nearly 10 hours. 18 men, while we sat in our vehicles waiting, engines idling, burning the fuel we could not afford to burn. I watched the gauge in my tank and said nothing. There was nothing to say. By the time we broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, we had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of our fuel allocation. We needed every drop we had been given just to reach the halfway point. We had nothing left for the return. The Americans at Honsfeld had left in such haste that fires were still burning in oil drums when we arrived. Coffee was still hot in metal cups abandoned on tables. Equipment, ammunition, rations, all left exactly as they had been when the order to withdraw reached them. And there, lined up along the road in the grey Predon light, were the jerry cans. Rows of them. American olive drab fuel containers stacked 3 meters high, extending for perhaps 200 meters in both directions. Hans Gruler, Piper's adjutant, pried open the first one, sniffed the contents, and looked at Piper with an expression I can still see when I close my eyes. High-octane gasoline, 50,000 gallons, 200,000 liters. The mathematics settled over us like warmth from a fire. I was part of the refueling detail. We worked in the grey morning cold, with the energy of men who had been given something they had stopped believing they would find. The fuel smelled different from what we were, accustomed to richer, cleaner, a higher octane than our vehicles were designed for. Several of the Tiger tanks had engine problems because the American gasoline was actually too refined for their Maybach engines, built for 74-octane fuel. The Americans had abandoned gasoline so good it caused trouble in German tanks. I remember finding this simultaneously ridiculous and deeply unsettling, though I could not have articulated why at the time. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann could read English. He had worked in his father's import business before the war. He found shipping manifests in the depot office and brought them to Piper. I was standing nearby when Piper read them. The fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and trucked 400 miles to Honsfeld. The journey had taken less than 6 weeks. 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. Piper read the papers twice, then crumpled them and dropped them on the ground. He said nothing, but I watched the color leave his face, and I picked up those crumpled papers after he walked away. And I read them myself, and I understood what had made him go pale. This fuel had traveled further than most German supply runs of the entire war. Delivered faster than we could move anything across our own territory to a forward depot that the Americans had abandoned without attempting to destroy. If they could afford to leave this behind, what were they keeping? Private Ernst Kara found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers, dated December 15th, 2 days old, delivered to a frontline position with the regularity of a peacetime mail service. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline, one pipeline delivering, every single day, more fuel than Kamprop Piper would consume in the entire offensive. I folded that newspaper and put it inside my uniform, and carried it for the rest of the campaign, though I cannot tell you exactly why. Perhaps because I understood, even then, that what I was holding was the true enemy intelligence report. The one that told us everything that our commanders had chosen not to tell us. We celebrated at Honsfeld, there is no other word for it. Men who had been counting liters for months suddenly had oceans, or what felt like oceans, and the columns surged forward with a momentum that felt almost like the early years of the war, when everything had seemed possible and the fuel had flowed and the maps had moved in the right direction. I climbed back into my Panther with the fuel gauge reading full for the first time in weeks, and for a few hours I allowed myself to believe again. It was the last time I would do that in this war. By evening on December 17th, we had reached Stavelot. Our maps showed a major American fuel depot there. Not a forward supply point like Honsfeld, but a primary facility. 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline stored in jerry cans across 15 acres. Enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse. Enough fuel, conceivably, to change the course of the battle. I remember the mood in our column as the lead vehicles approached, the specific quality of hope that desperate men manufacture when they see something they need badly enough. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of our approach. His orders were to deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. His engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks of jerry cans. At 16:30, as our advanced guard arrived, Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first white phosphorus grenade. The explosion was immediate. A wall of fire shot upward perhaps 30 meters. Within minutes, the entire depot was burning. Piper's lead tanks arrived to find a column of black smoke rising 300 meters into the sky, visible for 50 kilometers in every direction. The fire would burn for 3 days. Piper stood on his tank. Turretin watched the flames, without speaking, for approximately 5 minutes. I was close enough to see his face. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic, running calculations that kept producing the same answer no matter how many times he repeated them. Then he climbed down and said to his driver, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. They can afford it. What are we doing here?" It was not a question. His voice had the flat tone of a man who has understood something he cannot ununderstand, and knows that understanding it changes everything, and would prefer not to have understood it, but it is too late for that now. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps, rather than risk their capture at Trois Ponts. 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In total, the Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons during the first week of our offensive, more than the entire German fuel allocation for the operation, more than Germany had allocated for the entire Battle of the Bulge, burned as a denial tactic, as a routine operational precaution, by engineers who had so much of it that destroying millions of gallons was simply the sensible thing to do. I did not know these numbers at the time. I learned them after the war, when I could finally look at documents from both sides and understand what had actually happened during those days when I was inside it. Counting liters, watching gauges, listening to my engine, and calculating how many more kilometers it had in it before everything stopped. By December 19th, as we engaged defenders at Stoumont, tanks were being abandoned with empty fuel tanks, rather than from battle. Damage. Not knocked out, not burned, simply stopped. Empty. Piper consolidated the remaining fuel, approximately 8,000 gallons, and the mathematics presented themselves with the clarity of a sentence that has been constructed specifically to be understood and cannot be argued with. 8,000 gallons. Enough for one engagement or a retreat. Not both. We were 30 kilometers from the Meuse. The Meuse might as well have been on another continent. On December 20th, Piper gathered his commanders. Sturmbannführer Werner Potschquas direct. We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. According to testimony from several men who were present, Piper said, "Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which seemed to us like a miracle, was nothing to them. We cannot win. I was not in that room. I heard about it afterward, in the manner that important things always travel through a military unit imperfectly, in pieces, but with the essential truth intact. What I remember from that day is sitting in my Panther with the engine off to conserve fuel. In the snow, watching American P-47s overhead and knowing we had nothing to send against them. And understanding that the phrase, "we cannot win," was not defeatism or weakness. It was engineering. It was arithmetic. It was simply true. The American response during those same days demonstrated what industrial warfare actually meant when one side had access to it. General Patton's Third Army pivot north to relieve Bastogne required 350,000 gallons just for the redeployment, a maneuver that German planning doctrine would have classified as logistically impossible, accomplished in 3 days. American C-47 transport aircraft flew 316 sorties in a single day, delivering supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel to a surrounded garrison than our entire camp front possessed. On December 23rd, when clear weather finally arrived, Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties. Each P-47 burned 300 gallons per hour. 1 day of Allied air operations consumed more fuel than Germany had allocated for our entire offensive. I learned these numbers later, but I knew them in a different way in real time, watching those aircraft operate with a freedom and persistence that told anyone paying attention everything they needed to know about the supply situation on both sides. On December 20th, Piper received a final radio message from Corps. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. I have thought about those words many times in the 17 years since I heard them. Continue with available resources. We had none. The message was a military formality, the kind of order that exists to maintain the appearance of command authority when command authority has already been rendered meaningless by circumstances. We were to continue with nothing toward an objective we could not reach, against an enemy who was, at that moment, receiving 1.8 million gallons of fuel in a single day's delivery and building reserves while fighting on the night of December 23rd to 24th. Piper gave the order to abandon the vehicles and withdraw on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had crossed the line of departure on December 16th, 39 remained operational, not destroyed, not knocked out, simply stopped by empty fuel tanks. These were destroyed with our remaining ammunition rather than risk capture. Oberschutz Heinz Goals described the scene. We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, perhaps 200 gallons total. Piper personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks of equipment destroyed by empty fuel tanks. Of the 5,000 men who began the offensive with Kamprup Piper, approximately 770 returned. I was one of them. I have spent 79 years, not entirely certain why. The discoveries at Honsfeld and Stavelot spread through German ranks faster than any official communique. Colonel Friedrich van der Deer, captured on December 23rd, told his American interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons of fuel. We measure fuel by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" Field Marshal Model received the compiled reports on December 26th. His chief of staff recorded his reaction. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice. 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld. 2 million burned at Stavelot. 8 million destroyed rather than risk capture. He said, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept the numbers. He claimed the photographs of burning Stavelot were Hollywood special effects. But the men who had been there knew what they had seen, and what they had seen could not be unseen, and it traveled home in letters despite censorship. encoded in phrases that passed inspectors but meant everything to the families who received them. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote, "Americans wash their clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." The numbers that I learned after the war confirmed what my body had already understood during those 8 days in the Ardennes. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian fields, produced 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American output. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking, producing higher octane fuel more efficiently than our hydrogenation plants could manage at full capacity. And our plants were no longer at full capacity, having been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing since May. By September 1944, the Lunar Works, which had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed only 5,000 tons. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to 60. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. On the home front, there had been no private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo investigated the black market theft of individual liters. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows. This was the reality inside the Reich. While American forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily and receiving 8.2 million, building reserves while fighting, the fuel told us something else that I have needed a lifetime to fully understand. It told us that the war we believed we were fighting, the war of tactical genius against industrial mediocrity, of the superior warrior against the organized but soulless machine, had never existed. It was a story told by people who needed us to keep moving forward, to keep loading shells, to keep driving tanks, to all objectives that were logistically unreachable before we even started. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained and more experienced than his American counterpart. It did not matter, it could not matter. An experienced pilot who cannot fly because there is no fuel is not superior to a less experienced pilot in the air. A Panther crew with 100 combat missions, who sits immobile in the snow with an empty tank, is not more dangerous than a Sherman crew on their 3rd mission with a full tank and a depot 20 miles behind them. Courage without resources is not a military asset. It is a tragedy. I am 99 years old. The Tiger tank from Kampfrott Piper that ran out of fuel at Laglis sits in a museum there still, exactly where it stopped on December 23, 1944. People visit it and ask why such a powerful machine was abandoned. The fuel gauge reads empty. That is the answer. Everything that needed to be understood about that war, about what we were and what we were not and what we were fighting against, is contained in that gauge. Reading empty. We captured 190,000 liters of American fuel at Honsfeld and celebrated as though we had won something. By evening, we had watched 2 million gallons burn at Stavelot, burned deliberately, casually, as a routine denial tactic by engineers who had so much that destroying millions of gallons was simply the sensible thing to do. American daily consumption of fuel during the Ardennes offensive was 7.5 million gallons. Our capture at Honsfeld represented 0.6% of one American day's consumption. We had found a miracle, and it was a rounding error. I have lived 99 years carrying that knowledge, and I will tell you what it taught me. Not that we were bad soldiers, not that we lacked courage or skill, but that we were sent to fight a war that had already been decided in the oil fields of Texas and the refineries of Pennsylvania and the pipelines running under the English Channel. Decided by the time the first tank crossed the line of departure. Decided perhaps long before any of us had been old enough to put on a uniform. The fuel gauge read empty. It had always been going to read empty. We just did not know it yet when we were celebrating in the snow at Honsfeld at 5:30 in the morning on December 17th, 1944, pouring American gasoline into German tanks and believing for a few hours that God had taken our side after all.